so far, we've been looking at a kind of political, to some extent, and I guess we might say demographic, people, population, history. We haven't really got far beyond kind of round about 700. And we're not going to go far beyond 700 this week and next week either. Now we're going to look today, starting with me in a very, very general sense, and then next week on Friday, more specifically, we're going to look at the nature of Christianity, the early medieval church. Okay. Now, why, for a start, would I give a whole week's topic to look at the church? We've been looking at kind of chronological developments. Why would I choose to spend suddenly time looking at kind of religious history very specifically for a whole topic, for a whole week? Or in this case, sorry? No, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in anything. So that even more so. Why would an atheist want us to spend 3 hours discussing Christianity in this context?
Because it stands at the heart of medieval period.
Exactly, because it's a very important element in the nature of what we might call medieval culture. 1,000 years of history from around about 500 to 1500. And Christianity is a very, very important part of that on a number of levels. From a kind of non-believer's perspective, it's very important because it was the main medium, the main way that Roman and obviously Christian, whatever, mixed together, late Roman and early Roman culture was transmitted, not always perfectly, but literacy, thinking, creativity, organization, all of those things were transmitted primarily through the medium of the church. Now, it's often, so I've had students in the past saying, oh, medieval church, clergymen, the church, very, very bad thing, okay, that somehow religion is a bad thing. Now, I'm not religious, I said, but I wouldn't, and historians are not supposed to make kind of comments in a judgmental way anyway. But on a positive side, whether you believe in Christianity or not, if it hadn't been for these clergymen, there would have been very little culture would have been transmitted necessarily through the Middle Ages. So things would have been very different. So it's not a case of saying they deliberately were keeping literacy to themselves and making sure that the peasants could not read and write and the things that I'm often said. The fact is, at least they were doing it. Someone was doing it, okay? And in that sense, it's very important. And when you have some form of ideology, when you have some set of beliefs which you really strongly believe in, whether they're religious or another kind, and you focus on them, and then you focus your creativity and your imagination on them, that can lead to a flourishing and development in human society and human history as well. So Islam had the same effect in other parts of the world, and Christianity was very important in that respect for Europe. So we've mentioned the church and aspects of religion a lot during the past few weeks. So we're going to, today and Friday next week, we're going to look at some of those things in more detail. Okay? However, before we do all that, I think we should step back a little bit and just make sure that we understand some of the very fundamental and kind of basic questions. Now, if it turns out that everyone knows this, then I apologize in advance, but it's been my experience in the past that to understand and appreciate the church or whatever in the Middle Ages, you need to understand a little bit the basic fundamental things about Christianity and where it comes from and so on. So, when did Christianity begin? And how did Christianity begin?
After Peter.
Who's Peter? My friend when I was a kid at home or something? No, who? I can see where you're going with that, so that let's go even further back in a sense, but then the question is how far can we go back in a reliable way?
How far back can we go? Well, there was this Jewish guy, and he was hanging out. He was hanging out in Israel, and
Yeah, okay, we'll develop that then. Let's start with that one. So let's start with the figure Jesus Christ, okay, as known in English. What do we know about him? Who was he? Do we know anything about him? As historians, not as believers of one religion or another, but as historians, what can we say about someone called Jesus Christ? And obviously, if anyone's watching this on the internet and is thinking, let's go and get that heathen who's saying terrible things or whatever, I apologize in advance. But from an historical perspective, who was the figure of Jesus Christ? What can we say? Can we say anything about this man?
He was from Nazareth. He was a Jewish person.
Right. The Jewish context, we can assume definitely, okay. I mean, the first, what's the first question in a sense? Let's even take further. What do historians do? Go back to our first meeting. How do historians study the past? Christianity here is something in the past. We're not concerned with it as a living religion here. We're looking at it historically. If we want to reach back to those questions I was asking about Jesus Christ, what do we have to say first? What do historians think of first?
Do we have any Roman records about the life of Jesus, or does all of the context just come from the Bible?
Yeah, primarily everything that we can say in any great detail comes from the Bible. There are no contemporaneous, there are no records from the time when Jesus was meant to have lived, which we should say, I mean, technically, okay, Jesus is meant to be AD 1. Okay, because that's the first year of our Lord, that's when he's born. Now people suggest that in fact because of various things, it may have been 6 or 7 years earlier, take it back a little bit further or whatever, and so on. No, we're not going to get into that. I'm not even assuming we can get specific and start writing kind of a life story in chronological detail, but somewhere around about what we would call the beginning of the Christian era is when he's meant to have lived, okay? But our main source is the Bible, okay? This is the New Testament. We'll come back to that in a minute. There is no record which survives, whether it's kind of written or archaeological or whatever, which survives, which actually kind of mentions him. There are some later Roman writings by pagan Romans that refer to maybe Jesus. The question there is, they're writing later about the Christians rather than about the man himself, and they were transmitted, they were copied by later Christian writers, okay? So in many cases, it's been suggested that maybe the Christians in the Middle Ages added references in. I can't remember the details now, there's one that says he was the son of the Lord or something. Now that sounds like a Christian's added that bit in, okay, because a Roman pagan wouldn't say that. So even those, they're not contemporaneous, they're not from the same time, they're later, so they're not so trustworthy. So if we want to know about this guy, apart from knowing that he was Jewish and roughly where he came from, we are stuck with the Bible. Okay. What is the Bible?
Can I ask you a question?
You can, yeah.
What could be the reasons of there are no external sources except from the Bible related with the life of Jesus Christ?
Well, various answers to that. When he lived, he wasn't very important. Okay, so he was some guy wandering around, perhaps in Judea or whatever, doing things, and there were lots of people wandering around in Judea doing things or whatever. And for example, what is it? What's the big Essenes, the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on, okay? They were a small group of, fairly at the same kind of a time, group of a religious faction within Judaism and so on. Okay, now we know a lot about them from the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't know much about those guys at all. So it's kind of similar with Jesus, okay? Because of what happened later, we know about him. If his religion or whatever, or his followers had not created this successful religion, there wouldn't necessarily have been records of any sort, okay? And he would have been lost completely. And from the Roman period, you know, I don't know, we know 0.5% of people who lived at that time are mentioned, or less than that, far, far less than that. So most people were not recorded, whether they were ordinary people or slightly more important people, and he would fall into the second of those categories, I guess. So it's not that there's been a deliberate attempt to hide him or anything like that, it's just that the Romans were not concerned. That's just something going on over there, we're not so worried about that. But of course the Bible makes it seem perhaps more important than it was, and so on.
Can it be because of the language too? Jesus' language was Aramean or something?
Aramaic.
Aramaic, that is specific to that place, so people have difficulty in translating it or learning it, and language differences? Is it?
Translating what? What do you mean? I mean,
as far as I know, the language extinct after it, right? People.
Well, there are actually no, in Mersin people, Suryani people, they're speaking, their culture is descended from the Aramaic and so on in that sense, and they're obviously Christians as
But
well.
not the original version.
Not the Aramaic that would have existed, but then all languages are changing. I mean, everything's changing. Aramaic was perhaps the most widely spoken Semitic language in the Near East at that time, okay? The cultural dominant language was Greek, okay? But the spoken language was a spoken form of Aramaic, which becomes Syriac and so on later on. So I'm not sure exactly what we're getting at here, but obviously he wasn't necessarily kind of literate in Greek. I don't know if there's going to be discussion of that. We haven't got any proof of that. I don't know what the Bible, obviously written by other people. We'll come back to that in a minute. What about the Bible then? What is the Bible? Okay, historians begin with sources. So we've said there's not much or anything really from the Romans, a few later things which are of dubious reliability. They don't really tell us anything. I don't even think they necessarily prove he existed, necessarily, okay? They prove that a religion existed a bit later. They don't prove that he existed in that sense. So we start with the Bible. Let's go back to that source. Okay, sorry. Serkan?
The Bible,
Yeah, all right.
it has, well, in the Christian world, it has two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the New Testament has three parts, the Old Testament has three parts. The first one being the Word of God, unchanged. The second part being basically chronology, the chronology from the times of kings. And then we have other parts, such as the Psalms or things like that. And then we have a New Testament done with Jesus, because the First Testament was done with Abraham. No? Yes?
Yes and no, kind of thing. Okay. The Bible, as we call it, as you correctly say, is a combination of two main parts. What in English is called the Old Testament, Eski Ahit in Turkish, and the Yeni Ahit, the New Testament here. Okay, the Old Testament is a big collection of old, ancient Hebrew, Jewish, religious and historical writings. Okay, and the New Testament was written by different Christian believers from the very early years after Jesus was supposed to have lived and died. Sorry? And the Gospels are kind of the most important of that, and we'll come to that in a minute. And it was in the very late Roman period that they decided we need to kind of decide which are the true writings and which bits go together and so on. So the Bible, as we know it, was kind of created then from these two parts. Modern Jewish people, modern believers in the Hebrew Jewish religion, of course, accept their version of this as the Holy Book, but they don't accept that. Okay, it's the Christians that have put it together as the Bible. The Christians believed that their religion was kind of the next stage, the truth that was emerging from the Jewish religion. So they're worshipping their version of the Jewish God. So a lot of what you get in here kind of looks back to here and says, look, it kind of points forward. And so you find words and phrases, what they meant, they were pointing forward to Jesus there, and then they bring it back kind of that way. That's how they do it. And in churches, when you have readings in churches even today, you will have a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from the New Testament. They're thought to be kind of thematically connected somehow. They're feeding into one another. Obviously, the Jews would say, no, that's all wrong. This is all the truth, and so on. You don't put them both together. But the history of Christianity is reflected in the fact that their holy book combines both of these parts and so on. And their perspective on that is obviously slightly different to the perspective that the Jews would have, because it's seen as a kind of integral whole there in that sense. So, Jesus himself, primarily the earliest written references to him come in the Gospels, okay, of which there are 4, and kind of 3 of them are very closely connected. They're clearly borrowing kind of from each other and from common sources. There's clearly some textual relationship going on between three of them. And the fourth one, content but also style, is slightly different. Okay, so there's a kind of connection here and so on. Okay, Christians don't have any kind of problem with this. Now, most importantly, of course, whereas parts of the Old Testament are believed, like the Quran for Muslims, to be the Word of God which has been given, which has been revealed to prophets, particularly Moses for the first part. Okay, he receives the Word of God, so that's called the books of Moses and so on, in the same way that Muslims believe that the Quran was the Word of God given to the Prophet Muhammad and so forth. Christians don't say that about their testament. They don't say this is the Word of God given by God. They accept that these things were written by human beings. They're written by human beings who were possibly inspired by God, so divine inspiration. So they're not just making it up or coming up with it themselves, but God is helping them to write the truth in that sense as well. Okay, so slightly different take on the content there, in a sense, which perhaps provides a slightly different view. But our problem, therefore, is that if the earliest document which talks about Jesus and mentions Jesus is also the holy book, which becomes the basis for the religion that believes in him in a certain way, then there's a kind of circularity, there's a kind of problem going around here. Okay? Now, if you are a Christian, if you believe what is in the Bible in one way or another, and there are different interpretations of the New Testament and the whole thing, of course, but if you believe in this and you believe it is inspired by God and it is basically the truth, then you've got no problem. If, like me, and I presume like most or all of you, you're not a practicing Christian, and if you are a skeptical historian as well, and we have to be skeptical of our sources, then this circularity becomes an issue. Okay? We can't necessarily, at the extreme, we would say this is all made up. We can't prove anything. We can't even prove the man lived. This has all been made up. He could be completely fictional. Now, if there was really a man, and none of us believe that he would be God incarnate, God put onto earth, of course, because we don't necessarily believe that, and so on, but he was a real man who had some ideas, but other people changed him, then we're still kind of in the circle because we're still not sure what's true, because what's written is what his followers or the later people want us to believe. It's propaganda, it's religious propaganda. They want to persuade other people to join. And we wouldn't write political history just reading the propaganda of modern political parties, because we know they're trying to persuade people that they're correct or whatever. And what this is, in that sense, is something kind of similar. For us, in this course, you could say, well, that's not very important, David. We're not concerned about religious history from the 1st century AD. We're not concerned about who was Jesus. We're just concerned with people who 500, 700 years later believed in him in a certain way. And that's ultimately true. We don't need necessarily to have to worry about whether he existed or not. We're just concerned with understanding the beliefs and the impact on their lives that the religion had in various kind of ways. Okay, so that's the sort of first big thing. Yep.
Is it more or less the same situation with Paul as well? Or do we have any Roman records about Paul at all? I mean, we have, of course, about his journeys and things in the scripture, apparently, but other than that, contemporary?
I can't answer that question. Actually, no, I don't know the answer to that. But let's fill out this and then come to that point, because that's important. So the Gospels are the main part of the New Testament. What are the other two parts of the New Testament? The writings by Christians, put together by Christians.
Letters and Revelation.
Right. And I suppose we could add here, it's kind of overlaps, but what's called the Acts. This kind of picks up the story after Jesus has died and gone to heaven. This tells the story of his followers and what happened and how they moved around parts of Turkey and elsewhere trying to spread their religion and things like that. And that's where we get Peter and so on coming in, and Paul and so on. Most of the letters, not all of them, most of what are called the letters in the New Testament were written by Paul, St. Paul of Tarsus, from what is now Turkey. Okay, so let's put him here. And for many people, he, more than anyone else, was the architect which took, not literally, I mean memo architect, but the man who took these various ideas and beliefs, whatever they would be, and kind of synthesized and formalized them, and may have created the basis for a working religious system. Okay, he was the intellectual that took these ideas and kind of created it through his writings and through his connection with what's going on in the Acts and things like that. So that's kind of step two. Step one is Jesus, about which we're not sure, and then these Gospels that are connected to him in various ways. And then the figure of Paul comes a little bit later. Okay, he was a Jewish man as well. But seems to have been a Roman citizen, I believe, as well. So he was part of the Roman system as well as the Jewish world. And he converted to Christianity on the way to Damascus, the story goes. He went blind and then he realized his folly and so on. And he becomes then Paul or whatever, okay? And then we have, therefore, Christianity spreading, okay? But very, very slowly spreading in these early centuries, okay? It was a minority religion. It had no center. It had no real strong centralized organization. It began, let's just go and look at our map now. So we're obviously talking around, we're talking here, but very quickly you get people, you get the apostles and followers moving into Turkey, and then eventually getting over to Italy as well, okay? Those are again described in the Acts and so on. But if you look at this map here, it says 325, so the time of the Council of Nicaea, when big decisions were made, and we'll come to that in a minute, I hope. So at the time when Constantine had become a Christian, okay, these orange areas, and I don't even know if, I mean, Christianized doesn't mean, I don't suppose here, that so every single person living here or living here was a Christian. It just means these areas, Christianity had been spread significantly, okay? But it doesn't prove, that all the way up the Rhone Valley, you had 100% Jus Christians, okay? I'm fairly certain that wasn't the case. But dotted around various areas because of various people moving, and obviously, to a large extent, thanks to the Mediterranean world that was the center of the Roman Empire, in a sense. You can see areas going on there.
So what's the red cross and the black cross? I think the writing is like...
Yeah, well, we'll come to that in a minute. That's important church sites and so on, okay? Major early churches, okay? In the east, the patriarchates and so on, as they were and still are now. And then in the west, the red ones are the important early medieval churches, especially monasteries and things. But we're going to come to that, we'll come to the monasteries with Elif in a week and a half's time. A lot of early Christianity in its early first few hundred years was especially successful in spreading in urban areas. Urban means cities, towns, or whatever. Here is English word pagan. What does that mean? Pagan usually means what? If you call someone a pagan...
Not belong to everyone.
Polytheistic?
Yeah. I mean, you might call even an atheist a pagan, but that's not technically. It just means someone who believes in more than one God, who is not a believer in a monotheistic religion, so some kind of polytheist or whatever, things like that, okay? And the Latin form was paganus. Comes from pagus, which gives us French, for example, pay. Anyone know any French?
Means city?
Country, okay. Countryside in this sense as well, okay. Originally, Christianity was particularly good at spreading in towns, in the cities of Eastern and then later Western Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. So you had a pattern at a certain point where you could say most of the people who were Christians were living in or near large urban settlements, and most of the non-Christians, therefore the polytheists, were living in the countryside, because Christianity had not spread into the countryside so well at an earlier stage. So it was the country people, the paganos, the country guys, who were polytheists. So that's why a word which originally ought to mean a countryman has come to mean a polytheist, a pagan in modern English. Okay, there's a sort of shift in semantics there. But the original meaning of these words was someone in the countryside who was then equated with kind of non-Christian at a certain point or whatever. It's a bit like it's not in a religious sense, but urban here we use for something to do with towns. Urbane, if we add an E at the end, what does that mean? If you describe someone as urbane. Sorry? Urban means the city. Urbane tends to mean civilized. Oh, he's very urbane. We don't use it very often, but it implies. So the implication there is living in a city is civilized, and therefore the people outside the city are not civilized, okay, which is a common theme in human history. And here we've got the same kind of thing, but working with religious belief rather than with sort of cultural behavior or something like that. So in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity spreading piecemeal, especially around urban parts of the Roman Empire, and especially around the Mediterranean and up the rivers, as you can see there. Okay, it was decentralized. It was also persecuted. Persecuted means, sorry? Punished, attacked. Okay. Perhaps one of the problems, and I can't remember if we mentioned this before, polytheistic religions, we may have mentioned it, polytheistic religions are quite flexible. So your gods may be my gods. Remember the Saturday, Sunday, Saturn, Woden and all that, you just mix them all up together in that kind of sense. So your polytheistic gods, you worship a guy in the sky, so do I, different name, more or less the same, no problem, problem yok. As soon as you get a monotheist person coming along saying one god, then there's some kind of a problem, because he or she is not going to be able to fit in quite so nicely with the polytheistic approach. So for whatever reason, a number of Roman emperors sponsored or encouraged or didn't discourage the persecution of Christians. Now this may have been, again, because the Christians wrote the later history, they stressed this, they gave more importance to it than we should see. But clearly it was not, they didn't ignore it. They didn't say, okay, well, let's leave those guys alone, they're not very important. There seemed to be some issues here. Whether they just wanted to pick on someone to help themselves, 'cause it's always nice to provide a scapegoat, and everyone focuses their angry attention on that person, and then they leave you alone. It may have been something like that. Or it may have been that some emperors really felt threatened by this different way of thinking and believing or whatever. But there were periods when various emperors, including very important one, Diocletian, organized a significant kind of persecution of Christians. And you all know the common idea of, in the arenas in the Roman world, throwing the Christians to the lions. That's a very kind of common theme for people to watch and things like that. So it was not a very successful religion. Okay, what was the big point where we get away from being a small, decentralized, and to a large extent persecuted cult, we might say, to becoming something which grew into the most powerful religion in the world today, because it still has more followers than Islam or Judaism? What was the sort of event which led to that shift in its position? Sorry? No, that's all happened. Jesus is gone. Whether he's true or existed or whatever happened, people have certain ideas about him. They're believing in Jesus, but the religion that is early Christianity was pretty much an underground religion, persecuted or whatever, and so on. But by the time of the answer is Constantine. By the time of people like Theodoric the Ostrogoth and so on, Christianity is a very, very different religion, and the key was Constantine. Okay, Constantine's conversion, whatever that was, made it suddenly become an official religion. Okay. Now he didn't kind of make it official and force everyone to become Christian or anything like that. He wasn't that stupid. But and exactly what went on with him, because most of the writings about Constantine becoming Christian were written by later Christians, of course. But it's the first step on a fairly slow process that leads to this officialization of Christianity. Okay. And even after him, other emperors decided they didn't want to be Christian. So it wasn't that from then on the whole of the Roman Empire was in any way Christian. But it was the starting point. It was the catalyst that gradually, over the next few decades, would lead to a very, very rapid spread of Christianity. Because now it's connected increasingly with the Roman Empire. And that means a number of things. It means structure. The Roman Empire was a highly organized administrative system. Okay? We've seen how it kind of breaks down and decentralizes by the end of the Roman period. But at the time of Constantine, things had not, they'd been through difficult times in the 3rd century, but they were still fairly well organized and so on. And it had a structure. The empire was broken up into regions, which then had someone in charge of them, and they were responsible to someone else who reported up to the emperors and things like that. It had a whole structure. And what happens is gradually Christianity is absorbed into that structure. Okay. Does anyone know what, for an area, a region in the Christian world, what is the main kind of religious or ecclesiastical administrative unit in which organization for that area is done in terms of the religion? What's the main organizational unit of Christianity, whether it's Protestant ones or... that's the very, very local one, parish, okay? Bigger than the parish, above the parish. Yeah, the bishops, and what are they? Yeah, diocese, okay? They took basically the system of the Roman Empire and they said, okay, you've got these areas, and now they're also going to be the organization for the religious side of things. And they took the diocese from the Roman system and they put someone called an episcopus in Latin, okay? Bishop was put in charge of that, okay? And a collection of dioceses together, okay, were under someone called an archbishop, archiepiscopus, who was kind of controlling all of those bishops and things like that. But the bishop becomes the main one. A number of churches a number of bishopric seats claim to have special status. The two most important for us in the long run, of course, are Constantinople, where the main emperors were still living, and Rome. Saint Peter, who was one of the followers of Jesus, and according to the Bible, according to the New Testament, and perhaps was his most important follower, again, according to these writings, supposedly went to Rome and supposedly was the first, he took on that role. They call him the first bishop of Rome, okay? And in the New Testament, Jesus is supposed to have said, on this rock, Petros, rock, I will build my church. So if you read, depending on how you read that, it's implying that Saint Peter, Petros, the rock, because he was called something else before, Simon, but they had this name, was somehow the successor of Jesus. And therefore, whether it's true or not, later bishops of Rome claimed special status for various reasons. We'll look at these in detail next week. And that's the origins of the papacy, the popes, okay, in Rome. That's how that kind of gets going there. So that's a very important thing. Mentally, psychologically, perhaps better way of saying it, becoming connected to the Roman Empire and spreading and becoming bigger, obviously, but being integrated into the Roman system as well, also had a big effect on Christianity. Okay, 100 years earlier, it was a persecuted, small religion hiding away with no structure. Suddenly, or gradually, but fairly quickly, it becomes much more organized and so on. Okay, so its view of itself, it's become connected to this big administrative and militaristic institution, the empire. Okay, so even people have argued that the ideas of the early Christians were far more kind of peaceful, and after the time of Constantine, you get a more sort of confident and almost militaristic idea of converting people, of going and forcing people to become Christians or whatever, and things like that. What also do you get when you have central control? When you have someone, the emperor at least, who is the center of your religious world, when you have someone who will organize things for you. When you have something like this, okay, what's going on here in Egypt, a very early, important part of the Christian world, of course, what's going on for these guys is very different from what's going on up here, and they're not even in contact or whatever. What happens when suddenly the person living here, kind of thing, is now nominally at least in charge of the religion? He's not a religious person, the emperor is a secular person. Come to that in a minute, if we've got time. Yes, we've got 5 minutes. What happens when you have a boss, when you have structure, when you have organization, and so on, in terms of beliefs, in terms of interpretation? Sorry? Yeah, you begin to get people, I mean, even before you'll have arguments, but you begin to get people saying, my view is the right one. And that's because I've got the power to back it up. And your view about the Trinity, we were talking about Arianism and heresy last week, okay? As soon as you get someone with the power, the organizational, even the military power to say, I'm right, then you're wrong. Okay, this is the split between orthodoxy and what first we might call heterodoxy, the other ideas, which is a bit funny, and then finally heresy, which is completely wrong, and you're kind of outcast and no longer accepted, and so on. And what they did very, very early on, in the early councils of Nicaea and Chalcedon, was they said, okay, well, what's the right view? What is the Trinity? We need to know, and things like that. And Constantine was there in the early days, and so on, and gradually the truth becomes established and written down, and it's part of the system. Okay, so again, open to interpretation becomes less. You're either following the truth or you're not. Okay, so again, that's another very important effect of theologically, I suppose, in terms of beliefs, that Constantine's conversion and the connection to the Roman world had in that sense. So organizational structure, hierarchy becomes important. Okay, beliefs become important. Mentality, symbolism, and all these things become affected by these changes as well. We mentioned the papacy. You have a structure. What happens in Christianity, of course, and this is a problem sort of in the later years, is that you end up, from very early on, you end up with two parallel and in theory rival hierarchies, because you've got the emperor, and it was Constantine the emperor that kind of got it all going in this sense, but you've also got these bishops. Okay, some of them, the patriarch in Constantinople, the bishop of Rome in Rome, the later popes or whatever, claiming great authority over the church. So you've got these two parallel hierarchies claiming rival authority over people and so on. Now in Islam, sultans, caliphs were both kind of political and religious leaders at the same time. But in a sense, Christianity made a bit of a distinction. And in the later Middle Ages, you actually, and we're going to look at this in about 4 weeks' time, you get massive arguments, and you get popes saying, no, you can't be a king, you can't be emperor because you're not doing what I say. And the emperor saying, no, I'm going to come in with my army and kick you out of Rome and all sorts of stuff, because we've got these two sort of parallel hierarchies as well. And that's another product of the history of Christianity and how it developed in the early period in the after the conversion of Constantine. So that's very important there as well. Various other things, but we won't go in. Oh, the final thing, we've got the formal hierarchy. Okay, we're going to look at the papacy, I hope, in more detail next week. On the other hand, you have a slightly separate, more individualistic movement going on in early Christianity, okay, beginning in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and that creates a different set of churches, different set of people, leading a very different kind of a lifestyle, Christian lifestyle, than what the popes and so on were doing. That is monasticism, okay? People who believe strongly in their ideas but want to get away from the world, don't want to go out in the world in their religious sense and control the world from their perspective. They want to stay on their own or with a group of other people and contemplate God and think about things in a slightly different way. And from quite early on, we do have the development of monastic tradition, as Elif's going to say, probably beginning perhaps in Egypt, but spreading quite quickly elsewhere. Okay, and if you think of the later Middle Ages in Europe, all the big churches, the big monasteries and so on, okay, very wealthy institutions that are seen as kind of corrupt and negative, and the bad side, the way that Christianity is criticized by people at the time and by the Renaissance and by people still sometimes today, okay, the great monastic churches of the later Middle Ages, okay, very different from the early monasticism that we'll hear about, but growing out of that tradition. So a different side, a more individualistic, get away from things world, but making very, very important contributions to Christianity and to European history as well. Okay, right. So, no class on Friday because of my birthday or whatever, and no class next Tuesday because of my library seminar. So we'll meet again on Friday next week, try and remember all your names, it's such a long time away. And Elif, Zeynep, or whatever, I've forgotten already. Elif will give her presentation on monasticism, and I'm going to try and we need to find out what's happened to Gizem, because I'm concerned about that situation. If you see her, please say talk to David, or come and send David an email. Maybe we can find a solution for her concerns, okay?